Hey guys, welcome back. I'm so glad to have you here again. Thank you so much for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, you probably should, because this is going to be a long, informative series on the Constitution. And there are a lot of things in here that you should know. And there are a lot of things that, in fact, I honestly, I want you to research everything I say. It's all out there. Nothing I'm telling you is made up. None of it is from the back of my mind. This is all factual. Now, I have been asked, who am I to talk about the Constitution? Pretty soon I'm going to put together a list of the documents that I've not only read, but deeply studied. And the reason I'm not just going to lay that list out for you now is because it's taller than I am. I have a lot of free time. I have read thousands of pages of original writings from our founders discussing the Constitution. So, I have, firsthand knowledge, or I guess secondhand knowledge, because I'm reading the writings of the people who did this. So when I'm talking about these things, I am talking about the Constitution as it was intended to be, not as it stands today, because a lot of things have changed, and we'll discuss those changes at some point in this series. But understand that we are talking about antebellum constitutional law. We are talking about the Constitution as it existed, as was designed and written by the framers, and everything that was intended for us now. So let's get on with it. So we've talked about the style or the form of government, that we are a republic, not a democracy. If you don't understand that, then you need to go back and watch that video. And if you have any questions, please throw them at me in the comments. I'll try and get to them. We've also talked about the fact that we are a confederacy and not a nation. These are two important things to understand moving forward in the creation of our Constitution and in understanding how our Constitution is supposed to work. So now we get to the fun, well, not really the fun stuff, but we start getting into the layout of our government. Exactly how are we going to put together a government that is going to do the things that we need to do, make up for the failures that took place under the Articles of Confederation and help us function as a union without losing state sovereignty. How can we do that? How do we fill that gap between not enough power and too much power? So this was discussed heavily for a long time. It was argued, it was urged, and it was echoed over and over and over again. And so many different opinions came out, which is why there's a lot of confusion today. Some people, didn't follow the chain of opinions to see which ones won. Some people are saying, well, we're supposed to be this because this guy said that. Well, yeah, but he said that and then he was turned down. It was a no. So what was established? How did we figure this out? Well, the first order was to figure out Congress. How would we legislate? How would we make laws on behalf of each state government? So how do we lay this out to where the states are equally represented and the people are equally represented? Well, they started out with the idea of, the House, where, people would have representatives who would go to Washington and who would legislate on their behalf, who would represent them, each constituency as a separate entity. And that was a great idea and everybody was on board with it. But then they started thinking, well, wait a minute. You have some states that are just, far more populous than other states, which means that those states will have dozens of representatives when other states will only have 2 or 3 representatives. And that would actually kind of be a problem. It could easily become a problem for the weaker states. So they were concerned about that. So they said, well, maybe instead we'll do 2 representatives from each state. That'll do a good job of representing each state equally and fairly. And then it started getting, 2 representatives from each state's really not enough. We need more. And then finally it kind of melded into, how about we do both? Why not do both? So we'll create a House of Representatives who represents the people. and whose numbers are based on how many people are in each area. And we'll create a Senate who represents the states and how the states would work or would be represented equally. So these two things had to work together. They had to come up with a way for the two of them to work back and forth, to bounce laws back and forth off of each other until they were satisfied with them. So, again, one of the big concerns was they didn't want anybody having too much power. They wanted to make sure nobody had too much power. So they fought back and forth with this, and they decided, okay, well, we can do this, but we need to do it short term. And they had discussed everything from 2 years to 6 years to 3 years for each. And they eventually landed on, the 2-year terms for the Congress and the 6-year terms for the Senate. Now, electorally speaking, the idea was to separate them completely ideologically from each other. So one state would have representatives from all parties, from all constituencies, with all sorts of things that they would have to represent, all different ideas that they'd be representing. And the other house would specifically represent the state. So to do that without still ending up with a popular vote in the Senate and a popular vote in the House, they decided that the states would appoint the Senate. The senators from each state would be appointed by elected state officials, and then the representative would be elected by people, citizenry. And that was the way it was designed. And up until the Progressive Era, that worked really, really well. It's only been since the Progressive Era where that was changed that everything went to crap. But going back to that, this kept a lot of the conflict minimalized. Actually, let me rephrase that. It actually increased conflict, which was the point, to keep too much power from going to one hand. And that causes a different kind of conflict. That causes far more angry, a lot more angst. If too many people have too much power, it starts to feel like a democracy, and we've talked about how bad democracy is. So they were trying to keep democracy from happening by separating the two houses from soup to nuts. Everything about them was to be different. When they decided that they were going to elect the Senate, they were still worried about power. So what they wanted to do was be able to overturn as much of the Senate as possible from year to year. And the way they decided to do that was that every 2 years they would have an election for the Senate, and 1/3 of the Senate would be up for election. So that would mean that in 2 years, the first third of the Senate would be up for election. 2 more years, the second third would be up for election. And in 2 more years, the final third would be up for election, which means that in any given year, you could overturn 1/3 of the Senate, which was meant to help stifle, too much power on the back end. This was all working very well. It was a good plan. It had its flaws. I mean, everything has its flaws, and it had its flaws, and that led to some things almost right off the bat. But, if we want to get into history, there were a lot of conflicts, starting with John Adams, the second president, and going all the way up until today, obviously. So there were failures, but it was the best plan ever seen to that point. So they decided they were going to do it that way. They built the Congress. They said, okay, we have this great legislative body that does a good, equal job of representing people and states, and, they can fight over the laws and all that. So then what? They applied negative power to each. So if one of them came up with a bill and handed it to the other, and the other one would look at it and say, I don't like it, I'm not doing it. Here's some changes. If you want to do these changes, we can do it, and they'd send it back, right? So they could bounce the bills back and forth. But that wasn't quite enough. They knew that somebody was going to have to execute these laws. Whatever Congress, the representatives of the people, whatever the people's representatives wanted to do within the scope of the Constitution, the powers of the Constitution, which we'll also get into at some point here, probably not today. Whatever that was, there had to be somebody with the authority to enforce it. there had to be a magistrate. So, they started discussing, okay, so how do we do this magistrate thing? It's just too complicated to have however many people end up in Congress also enforcing these laws. So we need to have a separate branch. And we have to have that branch to where it could, enforce these laws, put them into place, not just enforce, but actually put them into place. So, basically kind of a police force, or a judge, kind of a mix of that, which is what a magistrate is. A magistrate doesn't create rules. He just takes those rules and says, okay, here's how I'm going to do it. Like if you think of a company and you think of the board of directors of the company actually makes the rules of the company, and then they hand them down to the CEO, whose job is to chiefly execute those orders. That was his job. So that's the president came along, the magistrate, the executive came along. Okay, so we'll create an executive. Maybe we should do two. Yeah, let's do two executives. We'll do two executives to execute the will of Congress. Oh, well, I'm afraid that if we have two, there would be so much conflict between the two of them that it would be almost immediately corrupt. A lot of things could go wrong, and it's just, it's natural for people to have different ideas on how best to do something. So they make the laws and they hand it to the executives, and the executives say, okay, I think the best way to get this law to work, to apply this law, is if we do blank. And the other one says, no, you got to do it this way. And they knew that conflict was going to arise. So they actually debated over that for some time. It was really an amazingly deep debate for something that seems to you and me so trivial and, superfluous. This became a big debate, and then suddenly just kind of came to an end. It was almost like, you know what, you're right. We do need one executive, but we need to take some of that power away, because if an executive has enough power to do whatever he wants, regardless of what Congress says, then we might as well not have a Congress. We might as well not have representation, right? So they decided to make his authority strictly negative. So now the executive, when handed the bill from Congress, has 10 days, I think it was, to either sign or veto that bill. And if he's, if as an executive, somebody says, okay, here's the new rules, here's what you got to do, and he looks at it and goes, I can't. There's just no way to do this. We don't have the things it takes to do this. So no, you bring it back to me when you do it in a way that we can do it. That was the concept. That was the construct. But they got to talking about that, and they were like, well, if we do it that way, if we give the executive enough authority that he can veto whatever Congress says, he could begin to use that as blackmail. He could start to tell Congress, you'll do what I do, or I will veto everything you give me. And he'd use his veto power to blackmail the Congress. So, this again was discussed in detail. It was argued by mainly Hamilton and Madison. I think we're two of the biggest, but I can't think of his name right now, but there's another guy, Rufus. Rufus was also pretty curious about this idea too. He was concerned. I know Rufus is a great name, right? So they decided that, well, what we'll do is we'll make it so if the executive says no, and it is a popular enough idea, then we will make it go back to Congress, and 2/3 of Congress can tell the executive, sorry buddy, this is the rule and you will do it. So that's the veto override authority that they gave back to Congress. So now Congress has the authority. That they are the strongest branch. People who call them equal branches don't read what our founders wrote. They were never meant to be equal in whole. The idea was the people who represent us and the states were supposed to be the authority, but they put in other branches to check that authority. So it's not equal, it's just different. So the Congress has the authority with enough popularity to override the president, right? So if the president vetoes it, Congress sends it back and says you're going to do it anyway, he's going to have to. If at that point the president says, well, I'm still not going to do it, well, it's time for impeachment. And you're saying, well, he didn't break any laws. Well, yeah, he did, because he didn't do his duty. He's supposed to execute the will of Congress. And a president who refuses to execute the will of Congress has, proven himself unfit for the job. It's not what he's there for. He's there to, execute, not to legislate. So there is one of the things we start talking about impeachment. Might as well throw a little of this out now. We're going to really cover impeachment later on when we get into the format of the Constitution. But for the moment, talking about impeachment, that is Congress's authority, because the Congress, is the boss of the president. And if the president's not doing his job, they do have the authority to impeach him. And when they say high crimes and misdemeanors, we're going to get into it more. But, any act that is not intently maldemeanor, if your demeanor is not purposefully bad, if it was, accidentally bad, if it's purposefully bad, then you have exercised maldemeanor. You have shown intentionally bad demeanor. If you have accidentally acted badly, then you have exercised misdemeanor. So anything Congress decides is a misdemeanor, in that any demeanor that they think is unbefitting of a president is impeachable. But like I said, we're going to get into that farther along and start giving you some of the examples to tell you why I'm saying that. It's not just me making this up. This is actually what the founders told us. So going back to the system. So now we have, our two branches. In British common law, the magistrate was almost always also the judge. And they felt like a person who does something is always going to judge himself right in doing it. And so when an executive does something, if you leave it to him to decide whether he did it right or wrong, he's always going to be right as far as he's concerned. So you couldn't give the magistrate, the executive, the authority to judge himself or the states that he's supposed to be executing these laws for. You had to create a third branch. So now you have a third branch whose job is to judge the many things that are in their job, which again, when we're into the format of the Constitution and we start talking about, Article 3, we will talk about the Supreme Court and the different courts and how that's supposed to lay out. But the long and short of it, there's, this common belief that the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution. That's a fallacy. That's absolutely wrong. The truth is, the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret laws as they pertain to the Constitution. The Constitution is written in English and it's been heavily backed by thousands of writings. It doesn't need to be interpreted. Unless you are from some other place where you do not speak our language, it does not need interpretation. The Constitution is cut and dry. It's a very simple document. It's only a page and a half, if that, of document in and of itself, depending on how big you print the letters, right? So, you don't need legal speak. You don't need interpretation. You don't need any of that to understand the Constitution. You just need to sit down and read it. So no, the Supreme Court's not there to interpret the Constitution. The Supreme Court is there to interpret laws that are passed as they pertain to the Constitution. So that is our three branches. It's why they created our three branches, and that's why they gave each one separate authorities. Now, in our next video, I think, depending on how things go, I have a couple different things planned, and I'm not sure how I want to format them. So you may get the format, the layout of the Constitution. Or, I might be having a discussion with somebody in one of these videos, possibly the next one, over the Constitution, just to answer questions that normal people who've never really studied it or read it would ask. People who don't know it the way I do. Because look, you probably think you know the Constitution because you've probably been taught certain parts of it your whole life. But if you haven't actually read and studied all of the conversations and debates and writings and essays and all the correspondence back and forth of all these people who were part of building the Constitution, you probably understand it at a 5th grade level. which is just to say that there is one, and your idea of the Constitution probably starts at the Bill of Rights and goes out with very little comprehension of all of the articles, all 7 articles of the Constitution. I can, without having to look, tell you what is in every single one, every section, every article of the Constitution. I can also take you through all of the books and all of the papers written, and without having to Google anything, I can flip them open to the pages that answer the questions that you're asking, because I have read them all so many times. So, you know, say what you want. Whether you believe I'm the guy to do this or not is irrelevant, because the information I'm giving you is not my information. It is the information of the founders as they explained it. And it's simple. So I'm just trying to help you get there without you having to read the thousands of documents that I've had to read. So listen, guys, I really appreciate it. You guys are awesome. Thank you for hanging in there for these things. I really hope I'm helping you understand things. I want you to ask me questions. I want you to confront me with things. I want you to, you know, even argue with me if you think I'm wrong on anything. By all means, if you never find the answer if you don't get into debates. Sometimes somebody else's perspective has to come into play. I can debate without getting angry, because none of this is a matter of emotion for me. It's a matter of, you know, factual information. So anyway, I keep going off into that rabbit trail, don't I? Thank you so much, guys. I love you. Please come back for the next video. You're going to be glad you did. Thank
you. You heard a while, but that's just what people do. The theory is you always find somebody new. I guess there was a time I believed